In a stunning political maneuver that has sent shockwaves through Washington, Donald Trump has officially gambled his political capital on the controversial Ken Paxton, completely sidelining incumbent Senator John Cornyn in a fiercely contested Texas Senate runoff. But with alarming new polling data and blaring historical warning sirens sounding, could this unprecedented and singular roll of the dice ultimately backfire and cost the Republican Party a critically important seat in the chamber? The former president recently utilized his preferred social media platform, Truth Social, to broadcast a lengthy, highly scrutinized statement declaring his formal endorsement of Paxton for the fiercely contested Texas Senate runoff election. This theatrical pronouncement was not entirely unexpected by astute political observers, especially when considering the recent comments from the incumbent. Just one day prior to the announcement, Senator John Cornyn openly admitted that he believed the window of opportunity to secure Trump's coveted backing had already sailed by. Cornyn explicitly noted that he was no longer expecting the former president's formal endorsement. However, the underlying architecture and the specific tone of Trump's digital proclamation were incredibly illuminating. Right from the opening sentences, Trump showered Paxton with enthusiastic praise, characterizing him as a dedicated, authentic MAGA warrior who has consistently delivered tangible results for the state of Texas. Revealingly, the former president deliberately waited all the way until the fourth paragraph of his extensive online post to even mention John Cornyn's name. When Trump finally pivoted to address the sitting senator, he offered a tepid acknowledgement, describing Cornyn as a good man with whom he had historically enjoyed a productive working relationship. However, Trump critically noted that Cornyn had noticeably failed to be supportive during difficult times. This singular pointed remark essentially encapsulates Donald Trump's entire political decision-making process in a nutshell. It operates as a strict demand to support him or else face the severe consequences. This calculated move represents a fascinating strategic shift and a noticeable backdown for the former president. During the initial round of primary balloting, it was actually John Cornyn who held the electoral lead over Ken Paxton. Originally, Trump had publicly stated his intention to simply endorse whichever candidate emerged victorious from that first round of voting. His fundamental logic at that specific time was to bypass a long, drawn-out primary battle that possessed the potential to damage the eventual Republican nominee's chances against the formidable Democratic challenger, James Tallarico. However, the mere suggestion that Trump might bestow his endorsement upon an establishment figure like Cornyn sparked a massive, explosive backlash among his core MAGA supporters. Following that intense grassroots pushback, Trump went noticeably quiet regarding the escalating Texas race for quite some time. For him to now execute a complete strategic flip and publicly champion Ken Paxton, a political figure who actually lost in that preliminary round of voting, signals a deeper underlying anxiety. This development echoes the recent political narrative surrounding Thomas Massie. It strongly suggests that Trump is growing increasingly worried about losing his grip and losing ground with his highly devoted MAGA base for the first time in a long while. Even if those dissenting voices do not constitute a full majority in opposition to him, the undeniable fact that Trump feels the need to shore up his support by endorsing a candidate like Ken Paxton is a highly risky bet. Paxton carries tons of political and legal baggage, creating a very real vulnerability that makes it very possible he could ultimately lose the general election to James Tallarico. That potential electoral loss could single-handedly be the deciding vote that determines control of the United States Senate. Making such a precarious gamble solely to appease his most extreme allies demonstrates that Trump is genuinely concerned about losing altitude with his own foundational base. Viewed from the perspective of Capitol Hill, this endorsement lands as an absolutely massive development and a devastating blow to Senate GOP leadership. Prominent figures, including Senate Majority Leader John Thune, had been actively pressing President Trump and his inner circle to throw his weight behind John Cornyn. The establishment Republicans residing in Washington deeply wanted to see Cornyn secure another term in the Senate, making this rejection a significant defeat that will carry massive implications for the Texas runoff happening next week. This unfolding situation highlights what many political insiders are calling the Trump retribution tour. John Cornyn is widely recognized as a politician who operates with a more bipartisan flair on Capitol Hill. Historically, he has liked to work across the aisle with Democrats, supported bipartisan deals, actively voted for them, and even helped craft them alongside his colleagues. Furthermore, he had previously exhibited a degree of skepticism regarding Donald Trump's political comeback. This dynamic perfectly illustrates the current political gravity governing the modern-day Republican Party. If a politician is not walking in complete lockstep with President Trump, they will face severe repercussions. We have witnessed this exact scenario unfold with Thomas Massie, Bill Cassidy, and state senators in Indiana and Louisiana, and now it is playing out on the grand stage of Texas. For the Republican leadership who lobbied hard for a Cornyn endorsement, the news of Trump officially backing Paxton is a bitter pill to swallow, injecting incredible tension into this already volatile political backdrop is a brand new poll released by the Barbara Jordan Public Policy Research and Survey Center at Texas Southern University. The critical data reveals a razor-thin margin between the potential general election candidates. The poll found Senator John Cornyn leading the Democrat James Tallarico by a mere 1% in a hypothetical matchup. Even more shockingly, Ken Paxton and James Tallarico are currently dead tied at 45%. Both of these alarming polling results sit precariously within the margin of error. The Tallarico campaign immediately seized on this emerging narrative. In a released public statement, Tallarico declared that it does not matter who wins the Republican runoff because his campaign already knows they are running against billionaire mega donors and a deeply corrupt political system. While winning in deeply conservative Texas will undoubtedly remain a tough uphill battle for Tallarico, Paxton is obviously his preferable opponent. Facing a candidate who has been indicted and carries a reputation for corruption perfectly bolsters Tallarico's central anti-corruption campaign message. It allows the Democrat to forcefully argue against an opponent who is heavily backed by controversial mega donors, specifically including those associated with the Epstein class. This localized Texan drama is unfolding against a deeply troubling national backdrop for the former president. A major question presently dominating the broader political landscape is just how much influence Donald Trump truly holds over his party and how that will factor into the upcoming November midterms. According to recent data analyzed by CNN's Harry Enten, the president's approval rating has plummeted to a new second-term low. While some analysts previously argued that Donald Trump possessed a solid floor of support, that theoretical floor currently looks remarkably unstable. He appears to continue falling right through it. This isn't just an isolated finding derived from the widely discussed New York Times poll. Rather, it is a consistent trend across a slew of recent polling data. Donald Trump is currently sitting well under a 40% approval rating. The New York Times and CBS both reported him at 37%. Ipsos placed him slightly lower at 36%, and a CNN poll showed him scraping the bottom at just 35%. When you aggregate this data, it becomes undeniably clear that he is hitting historic new lows, proving these numbers are part of a much larger, undeniable downward trend. To put a sub 40% approval rating into historical context during a president's second term, we only have two modern comparisons, and both spell absolute disaster for the incumbent's party in midterm elections. The first parallel was Richard Nixon in 1974. Under his deeply unpopular leadership, the Republican Party absolutely got crushed in the midterms, suffering huge catastrophic losses in both the House and the Senate. The second cautionary example is George W. Bush in 2006. Under his sub-40 approval rating, his party lost control of both chambers, suffering a devastating 30-seat loss in the House and a 6-seat loss in the United States Senate. Historically speaking, when a president's approval rating drops below this critical 40% threshold at this specific point in their second term, their affiliated party goes down in massive defeat. Furthermore, the annals of history show that these presidents never truly recover their legacy or their public standing. Richard Nixon was famously forced out of office by August of 1974 with a dismal 24% approval rating. Similarly, by the end of his term in 2009, George W. Bush was languishing in the high 20s. This represents a grim historical brotherhood of unpopularity that no ambitious politician wants to join, as it essentially guarantees ending a term deeply out of favor with the American public. Back in Texas, this pervasive national unpopularity severely complicates the mechanics of the impending runoff. Just because Donald Trump officially endorses John Cornyn does not inherently guarantee that the fiercely independent Texas base will automatically and blindly follow along. Cornyn is widely viewed across the state as a mainstream conservative hailing from the Bush era, and Texas has been embroiled in an ongoing internal political civil war for quite some time. While the conservative base typically follows Trump's lead, the state's political identity has shifted dramatically to become incredibly MAGA-centric. This intense rightward shift is exactly why Paxton has a legitimate chance to survive the upcoming runoff. Paxton can also likely draw from the vital pool of voters who initially supported Wesley Hunt. It is safe to assume that most of Hunt's political supporters voted specifically against Cornyn because they viewed him as the entrenched establishment candidate. It is highly unlikely that these anti-establishment voters will now suddenly pivot to support Cornyn. Instead, they are far more likely to cast their ballots for Paxton. Texas undeniably remains an incredibly conservative and unyielding Republican stronghold, particularly during the primary season. The political climate has shifted so radically that even a beloved figure like George W. Bush would likely struggle to survive a modern Texas primary. However, the general election presents a uniquely dangerous scenario because the Democrats have officially nominated James Tallarico, a man many political prognosticators consider to be a once-in-a-generation candidate. Having just recently survived a brutally tough primary of his own, Tallarico possesses the precise messaging framework, the ideal demeanor, and the broad crossover appeal necessary to make this a highly competitive race, especially against a polarizing figure like Ken Paxton and potentially even against Cornyn. This stark reality is exactly why strategic Republican advisors desperately tried to push Donald Trump toward formally endorsing John Cornyn. The underlying fear gripping Trump's inner circle and national Republicans is that if Paxton secures the nomination, the party will be forced to spend hundreds of millions of dollars just to defend and hold a Texas seat that should traditionally be an easy, automatic victory. They desperately wanted to avoid a financially draining runoff, and now they are staring ominously down the barrel of an incredibly costly general election. According to seasoned political analysts, this controversial endorsement actually represents a strategic political loss for Donald Trump, regardless of how aggressively he attempts to spin it publicly or how loudly his most devoted supporters celebrate the move. Experienced Republican strategists reportedly warned Trump well in advance. The smartest strategic move was to either stay completely neutral in the Texas primary or to back the safer option in Cornyn. This urgent counsel was rooted in pure tactical pragmatism rather than ideological purity. From a strictly clinical political standpoint, staying entirely out of the race would have been the safest available maneuver. Neutrality brilliantly insulates and protects the endorser. If you refuse to pick a side and the race unexpectedly goes poorly, you absorb absolutely zero collateral damage. Your political capital remains safely intact, and your overarching influence remains entirely unquestioned. However, the very second you attach your brand and your personal name to a candidate, and that candidate begins to visibly struggle, you instantly own that outcome, whether you desire to or not. The argument also strongly suggests that backing Cornyn would have been the vastly superior long-term decision for the Republican Party when carefully analyzing the broader national electoral map. While Cornyn is not entirely unbeatable in a distinctly hostile political environment, data suggests he would perform significantly better and demonstrate more resilience in a difficult general election than Paxton ever could. If given a genuine choice, Democratic strategists would eagerly choose to face Ken Paxton every single time. The strategic reasoning underpinning this preference is straightforward and undeniable. Paxton is universally viewed by the electorate as being significantly more ideologically extreme, both in his actual legislative policy positions and in his highly combative public persona. He is notably louder, more abrasive, and incredibly easily caricatured by the opposition as existing far outside the political mainstream. These specific traits actively motivate opposition voters to turn out at the polls in droves, while simultaneously making moderate, persuadable voters feel deeply uncomfortable. Furthermore, Paxton has managed to accumulate a massive, heavily documented record of personal and legal controversies. Over the years, a toxic mountain of baggage that Cornyn simply does not carry. This dark cloud of swirling controversy essentially hands the Democratic opposition a completely weaponized, ready-made attack architecture. They do not even have to expend resources constructing a narrative because the devastating negative headlines already exist in abundance. Therefore, evaluating the landscape from a strategic perspective, Trump's enthusiastic endorsement creates terrifying, compounding risks at multiple levels. In the immediate short term, if Paxton struggles politically or morphs into a massive electoral liability heading into the general election, Donald Trump will take direct personal damage. Because Trump consciously tied his own name to the Paxton campaign so publicly, the resulting fallout from a loss would not just belong to some random unnamed party figure. It would belong specifically and undeniably to Trump. In the longer term, highly vocal critics argue that this maneuver could severely hurt the broader Republican Party in the general election by intentionally elevating a deeply flawed candidate whom Democrats view as incredibly easy to attack. This is viewed as especially dangerous, given that the current political environment is already rapidly shaping up to be quite difficult for the overall Republican brand. Ultimately, this complex, multifaceted situation connects directly back to the larger, looming argument regarding Donald Trump's noticeably declining political standing. The core guiding thesis is this: when Trump's personal polling numbers were remarkably strong, his highly coveted golden endorsement carried enough sheer weight to completely overcome practically any candidate's inherent electoral weaknesses. His backing possessed the unique capacity to generate massive enthusiasm and single-handedly drive voter turnout, making his blessing an overwhelming net positive for practically any Republican seeking public office. In those halcyon days, aspiring candidates viciously competed against one another for his favor rather than quietly hoping he would mind his own business and maintain a stance of neutrality. However, the stark reality of his significantly weaker personal polling fundamentally changes that political math. When the primary endorser himself is deeply underwater in key battleground states and across vital demographics, his highly sought-after endorsement abruptly stops being a guaranteed foolproof political asset. Instead, it begins carrying a genuine, highly toxic element of risk. Consequently, every single high-profile endorsement Trump makes in the current climate now functions essentially as a highly dangerous two-way electoral bet. If his chosen candidate secures the ultimate victory, the political benefit flows almost entirely in the direction of the winning candidate. But if that strategically chosen candidate loses or severely underperforms expectations, the resulting political damage flows directly backward, splashing straight onto Donald Trump. This rapidly evolving dynamic raises fresh, distinctly uncomfortable questions about whether the former president's legendary political touch has finally begun to fade. The core argument being presented is not necessarily claiming that Donald Trump is completely finished in the political arena. Rather, it is highlighting that the complex strategic cost-benefit calculation inherently surrounding his political endorsements has shifted dramatically. It represents a stark, unavoidable new reality that both he and the broader Republican Party are going to have to fully and honestly reckon with, regardless of whether they possess the requisite courage to acknowledge it publicly or not. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching Daniel Cave. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button right now to actively help us reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers. And be sure to drop absolutely everything you are currently thinking about this situation down in the comments section below.